Valve's Steam Deck handheld PC pushes out impressive frame rates in a wide range of software, including many current-gen titles. A broad array of demanding games are at least playable on the portable, and many cross-gen and last-gen games excel. But the steady drumbeat of progress gets pounded every day, and we're seeing an increasing number of games that truly push current-gen consoles and mainstream PC systems hard. With that in mind, I thought we should take a look back at last year's AAA PC fair to see how they cope on Steam Deck, across a broad range of games, which titles work well, and which prove too much. Is 2024 ultimately too big for Steam Deck? A number of less demanding 2024 games still fare pretty well on Steam Deck. Foremost here is LEGO Horizon Adventures, a beautiful UE5 title that runs at a high performance level on Valve's Handheld. With high settings dialed in and TSR set to 50% scale, we're well within the range of a solid, stable 30 FPS experience, with 40 FPS a good target in many situations as well. I'm using the Steam Deck OLED set to 60Hz output here for capture purposes, but the console natively can run with a range of panel refresh rates up to 90Hz. Depending on your refresh and FPS settings, frame time variance can look a little different to what I'm displaying here, though overall performance levels should be very similar. We could cut settings down a peg to hit a higher refresh rate, but the visual target we have established here looks great. Image quality is quite solid with TSR, and the game's lumen-powered lighting is perfectly intact as well. Compared to PS5, obviously image quality takes a big hit, as do the shadow maps, but outside of those changes and some simplified water, it's a broadly comparable visual experience. That's really what we want to see on devices like the Steam Deck and Series S. Broadly similar lighting and assets, with compromises mostly coming down to resolution. I don't really have any objections to how Horizon Adventures looks here, and it operates at a really stellar performance level given how good the game looks. A lot of other games run reasonably well, if not quite at that level. Sony's PC ports continue to come in at a pretty rapid clip, and 2024 saw the release of God of War Ragnarök. I'm running Sony Santa Monica's Epic here with FSR 3.1 in its performance preset, with low settings across the board to keep the game running at a reasonable clip. Low settings isn't the end of the world here though, as the game isn't stripped of any basic lighting systems. Volumetrics are still intact, for example, and the shadow maps look reasonable enough in typical play. It looks broadly like the console code, if obviously degraded in quality. The game's performance level is solid and relatively stable, usually reaching or exceeding 40 FPS. It actually lands on 40 FPS exactly a curious amount of the time, often hugging that specific frame rate for extended periods. It's a reasonable, if unexciting, turnout for a cross-gen title. Image quality takes a bit more of a hit than I'd like here, as FSR struggles a bit with particle effects and other complex content, though it doesn't look too bad on the Steam Deck's actual display. Metaphor Refantazio is another title that basically works well enough on Valve's handheld. I'm running the Atlas RPG with some pretty normal setting selections at native 720p. Metaphor has somewhat lopsided performance, as 60 FPS is pretty easily achieved in dungeons and fights, while more complex city scenes bring us into the 20s. It's not exactly the most visually complex game, or particularly performant one considering its visuals, but we can score a decent enough 30 FPS experience here. More demanding titles though really stress the Steam Deck's capabilities in a more fundamental sense. Black Myth Wukong benefits from minimum settings across the board to work acceptably, though I did bump shadows to medium to avoid some distracting artifacting that was present with low shadows. The visual outcome here is probably less than satisfactory, with low quality indirect lighting, odd looking enemy fur, and artifact ridden imagery. Frame rates though are reasonable considering the game's pedigree. We're in the 30 to 50 FPS range typically, with occasional stutters but no real extended frame rate drops outside of the game's introductory sequence, which remains very demanding. Later stages in the game are reported to have bigger stuttering issues on PC though, so performance may flag in other areas. Dragon Age the Veilguard rounds out our grouping of playable deck games, but only barely in my opinion. To get acceptable performance, I've had to dial in the low settings preset, and I'm using the game's well-calibrated DRS system pegged to 30 FPS with FSR2, with a minimum value of 20% of 720p or just 144p. Using DRS here gives us the crispest visuals realistically possible, though certain intense moments can appear a little abstract towards that lower resolution bound. I generally don't mind FSR2 in Veilguard, but the low-res rendering again doesn't flatter this game's detailed artwork. Frame rates are sort of reasonable here. Despite using DRS, there's pretty wide variance between scenes, with the game floating from 30 to 60 FPS in typical play. It doesn't really drop beneath 30 FPS though, which is the metric we're looking for. Again, image quality is the major sacrifice. The game really doesn't look like itself at the resolutions that we're contemplating here. Unfortunately, a large contingent of recent AAA fare runs extremely poorly on Steam Deck, to the point where I would deem the games broadly unplayable. Some games are a bit borderline, like Final Fantasy XVI. Here, performance is a bit lopsided. In lighter scenes with the on-screen settings, we can get a decent turnout holding in the 40 to 60 FPS range, but more intense combat, including most cutscenes, drop beneath 30. That reflects the game's performance on PC and consoles, where the game is unusually heavy, with somewhat spiky GPU-bound frame times. I'd say this is not quite there in terms of playability, and Valve agrees. Like all the games we'll be discussing after this point, it earns the unsupported on Steam Deck label on Steam. Horizon Forbidden West is technically a cross-gen title, but its PC iteration is based firmly on the PS5 code, and it runs rather poorly on deck. The game has a pretty handy DRS system here, which helps to salvage image quality and keep performance in check, but spiky frame times and sub 30 FPS stretches are still common on the very low preset. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 actually manages to hold up okay here in a lot of sequences, as long as we dial settings quite low. But the issues emerge in bigger fights, where the large number of foes seems to overwhelm the deck's 4-core CPU. Performance figures here aren't great, and as such, I deem the game basically unplayable. Dragon's Dogma 2 is similarly fated. Low settings with FSR3 in Ultra Performance mode produces inconsistent gameplay with long stretches below 30 FPS. That includes the now infamous city run that jacks up CPU load, as well as stretches in the wilderness where we can hit frame rates around 15 FPS. This is Dragon's Dogma at its lowest settings, without ray tracing, but it's still substantially too heavy for Valve's Handheld. Let's close out with a pair of UE5 heavy hitters. Silent Hill 2 is unsurprisingly a pretty miserable experience here, with poor frame rates even at the lowest settings I could configure. The trifecta of Lumen, Nanite, and heavy volumetrics is likely killing performance here, as the deck is just nowhere near where it needs to be. I also gave Stalker 2 a brief shot, which lets me configure a static 25% resolution scale just 160p. The visuals are rather painterly, and the game has some obvious CPU issues, though GPU-wise it's lighter than Silent Hill, at least as it can be configured here. Star Wars Outlaws and Indiana Jones and The Great Circle were also part of my preliminary testing list, but neither made the grade during my testing, as neither can progress past the splash screen. Outlaws seems to have a long-standing controller issue, while Great Circle seems to have a problem in a recently introduced patch. I wouldn't expect good things out of either game though, even if they were running correctly. Overall, the deck just isn't up to the task with a pretty wide range of current-gen software. But the Steam Deck isn't the only portable we have at our disposal, so I decided to take out my Bazite-equipped ROG Ally in its high TDP turbo mode and see if I could log any decent playable results. Silent Hill 2 provides a good idea of the upper bound performance differential here, with around double the performance of the deck. Space Marine 2 just cruises along, with performance usually hovering between 40 and 50 FPS, even in intense sequences where the Steam Deck suffered far lower frame rates. Dragon's Dogma 2 clocks a big uplift from the low 20s on Steam Deck to the mid 30s on Ally, and Stalker 2 runs at a higher performance level with somewhat less obtrusive stutter, though it is the most variable of the games tested here. Keep in mind that we're running both systems with Linux and Proton, so any differentials with the Steam Deck here should come down to raw hardware power, and not to any operating system divergence. I think my big takeaway from this whole exercise is that more games than ever are a poor experience on Steam Deck. You really have to pick and choose. Last-gen ports should mostly be okay, while a limited grouping of current-gen software will pass muster, often by small margins. But more ambitious current-gen titles will often run quite poorly, if they run at all. It's no longer a reasonable assumption to think that the vast majority of games will be at least okay on Steam Deck, which was generally true earlier in the system's lifecycle. For a lot of games, we really need to see a generational uplift in Steam Deck capability, and there are some promising signs on the horizon. AMD's Strix Halo can achieve excellent performance at TDPs that are similar to some portable gaming handhelds. And FSR 4 seems poised to greatly improve on FSR 2 and 3, which we tend to rely on heavily in Deck software. Perhaps a next-generation device packing an 8-core CPU, a Meteor GPU, and additional RAM and memory bandwidth could deliver transformative results in some of the titles we've surveyed today. I think testing on the ROG Ally in turbo mode gives us some positive signs. We see generally playable performance in the games I declared unplayable on the Steam Deck OLED. More demanding games seem to like the Ally in particular, especially its much more powerful CPU. For newer games, a Steam Deck 2-like device needs to come closer to a Series S level spec to reach that minimum target that most developers are aiming for this generation. Getting something like ROG Ally Turbo performance at a reasonable TDP would be a good point to shoot for, especially if the screen resolution remains an easier to hit 800p or 720p. That's the challenge for Valve going forward, and for any other OEMs operating in the PC handheld space. But for now, the outlook on Steam Deck isn't so rosy anymore. Unfortunately, 2024 is indeed too big for Steam Deck. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitaldefender.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.